The Moon Over the Mountain. Atsushi Nakajima. Li Jing of Longxi was a very talented and learned young man. In the last year of the Tianbao era, he passed the examination to become a government official. He was put in charge of police and military affairs in the area south of the lower reaches of the Yangtze River. However, strong-willed and self-confident, Li Jing could not be satisfied with his status as a low-ranking official. He soon resigned his office and returned to his native Guolu. He cut off all contact with anyone outside his family and devoted his life to writing poetry. He did not want to continue to be a minor official who often had to bend his knee before vulgar superiors. He preferred to leave his name as a poet that might last 100 years after his death. But literary fame, he found, was not so easy to gain, and day by day his personal situation became worse. Gradually, he was getting anxious. His face took on harsh cruelty, and his body grew emaciated. His eyes had a strange glitter. There was no trace of the handsome, rosy-cheeked youth who had passed the rigorous official examination. After a few years, he was no longer able to bear his poverty. Li Jing bent his principles to provide food and clothing for his wife and children, and set off again for the east. He was given a job as a local official there. He did this in part, too, because he had all but despaired of succeeding as a poet. By this time, his former classmates had long since climbed to high positions. Li Jing's self-esteem was severely damaged. He was shocked to take orders from men he had deemed dull when he himself had been so promising. A melancholy overtook him. He grew increasingly unable to suppress his half-mad egotism. After a year under these circumstances, Li Jing set out on official business. When he had stayed on the banks of a river, he finally went mad. Late one night, he rose from his bed with an uncanny look on his face. He rushed out of the inn, shouting unintelligible gibberish, and plunged into the darkness. He never returned. His acquaintances searched nearby mountains and moors, but they did not find any clues about his whereabouts. No one knew what had become of Li Jing. The following year, the imperial inspector Yuan Ken of Qinjun received an imperial command to travel to Lingnan. Along the way, he stopped at Shangyu. Before dawn the next day, he was preparing to set out. At that time, the man in charge of the official lodgings warned him about a man-eating tiger on the road ahead. Travelers could only pass safely in broad daylight. Since it was still so early, it would be preferable to wait until the break of day, he said. However, Yuan Ken was with many of his retinues, so he ignored this advice and set out. By what little remained of the moonlight, they made their way through a grassy area of a forest. Suddenly, a tiger jumped out from the thicket. The tiger appeared ready to attack Yuan Ken, but it abruptly turned around and retreated. A human voice could now be heard from the thicket. It was muttering over and over. That was a very near thing. It was a voice that Yuan Ken had heard before. In the midst of his shock and fear, he remembered whose voice it was. "Why, it's my old friend, Master Li Jing," he cried out. Yuan Ken had passed the official examinations in the same year as Li Jing. Yuan Ken had been one of his very few close friends. Perhaps because Yuan Ken's warm and amiable personality had never clashed with Li Jing's more extreme nature. At first, there was no response from the thicket, just occasional faint sounds, as of someone weeping. After a while, a low voice replied, "Indeed, I am Li Jing of Longxi." Yuan Ken forgot all fear. He dismounted from his horse and approached the thicket. He was wishing to greet his old friend whom he had not met for so many years. But why would Li Jing not emerge and show himself? He asked. Li Zhang's voice answered that he was no longer in human form. How could he shamelessly expose himself in his degradation to his old friend? For if he did, his friend would surely feel nothing but fear and loathing. Still, having encountered Yuan Can, by chance like this, he could almost forget his shame, in the joy of seeing him. Could you somehow overlook my hideous state and talk with me for a while as your former friend Li Zhang? Although it seemed odd when he later recalled this moment, Yuan Can was able to accept the fact of this supernatural wonder very calmly, without doubt. He ordered his subordinate to stop the party, and he stood by the thicket. He began a conversation with the voice of the person unseen. They talked about the gossip of the capital, news of old acquaintances, Yuan Can's current position, and Li Zhang's words of congratulation on it. After speaking of all these things in the familiar manner of men who have known each other from their youth, Yuan Can asked Li Zhang how he had come to his present state. This is what the voice said: I was traveling about a year ago. I stopped for the night at an inn on the banks of the Ru River. I slept for a while, then suddenly awakened to hear my name being called. I went outdoors into the darkness, and the voice repeatedly called me. I found myself running in pursuit of the voice. Furiously, I ran and ran. I went into a mountain wood. Before long, I found myself grasping the earth with both hands as I ran. I felt an unaccountable sense of power filling my body as I leapt lightly over rocks. I noticed that fur was beginning to sprout on my hands and elbows. After daybreak, I looked into a stream to see my reflection and discovered that I had become a tiger. At first, I could not believe my eyes. Then I thought it must be a dream. After all, I had had experience of dreams in which, while dreaming, I knew that it was a dream. When I finally had to accept that this was no dream, I was stunned. And then I was afraid. So, then, very strange things can happen, I thought. I was deeply afraid. But why had this happened? I had no idea. We understand nothing, it seems. Things are pressed upon us, and we must patiently accept them without understanding. We must continue living without knowing why. It is our fate as creatures. At once, I thought of death. But at that moment, a rabbit ran before me. In an instant, the human being within me disappeared. When it reappeared, I awoke to find my mouth smeared with blood and rabbit fur scattered around me. That was my first experience as a tiger. And as for what I have continued to do from then until the present, I cannot bear to say. Yet, for a few hours each day, my human consciousness returns. Then, as in former days, I can use human speech and think complex thoughts, and even recite passages from the Confucian classics. When, with my human consciousness, I see the results of my savagery as a tiger and reflect upon my fate, I feel misery, fear, and anger. But with time, those few hours of human consciousness are growing fewer and fewer. For a while, I often wondered why I had turned into a tiger. However, the other day, I found myself wondering why I had once been a human being. What a terrible thing that is. Soon, the human consciousness that I still have will disappear, buried beneath the ways of a beast. It is like the foundations of an ancient palace, gradually being buried beneath the sand. When that happens, I will lose my past entirely and wander about as a raging tiger. If I should happen to encounter you along the way, I would not recognize you as an old friend. And I would tear you to pieces, and devour you without a moment's regret. Actually, all beasts and men were originally something else, I am sure. At first, they remember what they were. Then gradually they forget, convinced that their present shape was not ever any different. But never mind about that. If the human consciousness within me were to completely disappear, I would probably be happier than I am now. Yet the human being within me fears that more than anything else. How very frightening, sad, and painful that outcome seems, that I should lose all memory of having been human. How can others understand what I feel? They cannot, unless they have experienced the very same thing. But wait, I have a favor to ask of you before I cease entirely to be human. Yuan Kan and his party listened with bated breath to the extraordinary things the voice from the thicket was saying. It went on, my sole aim in life was to win fame as a poet. However, my goal has gone unachieved, and I have come to this. The several hundred poems that I wrote are unknown to the world. I doubt that anyone could even find the paper they were written on. However, there are many poems that I can recite from memory. And I beg of you, please write them down and make them known. It is not that I would consider myself a proper poet if you were to do so. No, whether the poems are good or bad, I would not rest easy in my grave without passing these poems on to later generations. They represent my deepest passion in life, even to the point of losing my fortune and sanity. Yuan Kan ordered one of his subordinates to take up a brush and write down what the voice from the thicket recited. Li Zhang's voice rang out clearly from the thicket. He recited 30 long and short poems, elegant in expression and lofty in sentiment. They all were showing, even upon first hearing, the poet's uncommon ability. Yet Yuan Kan, although deeply impressed, could not overcome a vague thought. There could be no question that the poet's talents were first-rate. But there was a subtle lack that kept the poems from achieving the highest quality. Li Zhang, having finished his recitation of his old poems, suddenly turned to mocking himself. It is shameful to admit, but even now that I have sunk to such a degraded state, I still sometimes dream. I wish that a volume of my poems rests on the reading desks of the cultivated gentlemen of Chang'an. That is what I dream as I lie in my mountain cave. Is that not ridiculous, the spectacle of a man who failed to become a poet and became a tiger instead? Yuan Kan recalled the youthful Li Zhang's tendency for self-mockery and listened with a heavy heart. Well, continued Li Zhang, shall I add to the fun by composing an improvised poem expressing my present feelings? Just to prove that the old Li Zhang is still alive somewhere inside this tiger. May I? Yuan Kan again ordered his subordinate to take down the poem, which went as follows. Without any warning, I went crazy and took the form of a beast. Misfortune haunted me, and I could not escape it. Now that I have claws and fangs, there is no one who can stand against me. When I was a human, my reputation and achievements were high. I became a tiger in the thicket, but you have already been promoted and have a lot of power. Tonight, I gaze at the bright moon over the mountain. Unable to sing an ode, I can only howl. By then, the light of the moon had grown faint, and white dew covered the ground. The chill wind that blew among the trees told the party that dawn was near. Everyone now, forgetting the strangeness of the tale, joined in respectfully lamenting this poet's misfortunes. Li Zhang's voice went on. I said a moment ago that I did not know why I met this fate. However, when I think carefully about it, I have in fact some idea why. When I was a man, I did my best to avoid contact with others. People thought I was arrogant and self-important. They did not realize it was, rather, shyness that made me act that way. Of course, I was not without pride in my old reputation as a genius among the boys of my hometown. But it was a timid kind of pride. I hoped to make a name for myself as a poet, but I never attached myself to a teacher or sought out the company of other poets who might have helped me improve my skill. At the same time, I had no intention of ranking myself among ordinary people. However, this was the result of my timid pride and a disdainful shyness. Fearing that I might not be a jewel, I made no effort to polish myself. But half believing that I might be a jewel, I could not rest content among the common people. Little by little, I grew apart from the world and distant from others. I fed my cowardly self-respect with rage, shame, and self-pity. I have heard that we are all trainers of wild beasts, and the beasts in question are our own inner selves. In my case, the beast inside me was my self-important sense of shame. That was my tiger, and it damaged me, brought sorrow to my wife and children, and wounded my friends. In the end, the beast changed my outward form into this animal that befits my inward state. I realize now that I wasted what little real talent I had. With my lips, I repeated the old saying that life is far too long to do nothing, but far too short to do something of value. However, all there was in me was a cowardly fear that my lack of talent might be revealed and a lazy hatred for taking the pains needed to nurture it. There are many men with talent far weaker than mine, but they have become splendid poets. They devoted themselves to polishing and improving what they had. Now that I have turned into a tiger, I realize that at last, and it fills me with burning regret. I can no longer live as a human being. Even if I could compose in my mind the most wonderful poem, how could it ever be published? And my mind itself is becoming more like a tiger's with each passing day. What shall I do with my wasted past? When the pain is too great to bear, I climb up to the crag at the top of the mountain and howl into the empty valleys. I want my burning sorrow to be known. Last night, I howled at the moon from that same spot, hoping that someone might somehow understand. But the animals, when they hear my voice, crouch on the ground in fear. And the mountains, trees, moon, and dew know only that a tiger has gone mad and is roaring in his rage. I could leap up to the heavens, or throw myself to the ground, lamenting, yet there is no one who understands what I feel. It's just as there was no one who understood my vulnerable heart when I was a human being. If my fur looks wet, it is not only with the night dew. Finally, the surrounding darkness began to fade. From beyond the trees came the mournful sound of a horn announcing dawn. And now we must say farewell, since the time of my madness, the time when I must return to my tiger state, is near, said Li Zhang's voice. But I have yet another favor to beg before we part. It concerns my wife and children, who are still in Guolu. Of course, they know nothing about my fate. After you return from the south, would you tell them that I have died? I do not want them to know anything about what has passed between us today. And, although it is presumptuous of me, I beg you, have pity on their abandoned state and do what you can so they do not die of cold and hunger by some roadside. It would be a debt of gratitude I can never hope to repay. Li Jing having spoken these words, a loud cry came from within the thicket. Yuan Can was in tears as he assured his old friend that he would do what was asked. However, Li Zhang's voice resumed a tone of self-mockery. Were I human in the least, I would have begged for this favor before anything else. A man who is more concerned about his wretched poetry than about his wife and children deserves the fate of becoming a beast. Li Jing then warned Yuan Ken that when he made the return journey from Lingnan, he must take care not to come this way. By then, Li Zhang's madness would have returned and, unable to recognize his old friend, he might well attack him. Finally, Li Jing asked Yuan Ken that when he reached the top of the hill 100 paces ahead, he looked back in this direction. Li Jing wished to show him his present form once more. It was not to impress Yuan Ken with his power, but rather, by showing him the hideous beast he had become, to ensure that Yuan Can would have no desire to pass this way in order to meet him again. Yuan Can turned toward the thicket and said heartfelt words of farewell, and then mounted his horse. Once again, the sound of a human voice weeping uncontrollably was heard. Yuan Can, too, wept as he rode away, glancing back several times. When the group of travelers reached the top of the hill, they turned to look back at the grassy area in the grove. They saw a tiger spring out from the thick grass and onto the road. The tiger gazed up at the moon, already pale, having lost its brilliance, and roared mightily 2 times, 3 times, then leapt back into the brush. They never saw the tiger again.